Happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there in our parish and throughout Australia. I hope you all have a good day and that your families pamper you a little bit on this Father's Day. It's also, of course, the beginning of spring in our country, and the weather will start to warm up again. So let's get ready for hopefully a better summer than we had last time. In the Gospel or the readings today, we hear about wisdom and the way that the scriptures talk about wisdom, the way that we understand it from a Christian perspective, is really quite different to a secular understanding of wisdom. If I went and asked anybody in the street what they thought a person with wisdom would look like, they might say something like that they have a lot of life experience, perhaps that they're educated and they have a good dose of common sense. And all of those things are good. But when the scriptures talk about wisdom, or when we talk about wisdom from a Christian understanding, while it doesn't exclude those things, at the heart of it is really a friendship with God. So in the scriptures, the wise person is the friend of God because they enter into a relationship, a communion with God, and the wisdom that they have is not human wisdom, but rather it's God's wisdom. So it's this intimate relationship with God that we're called to as Christians, something that we don't get a lot from learning, but through being a disciple of the Lord, following his commands. And ultimately, this kind of wisdom is the gift of God himself to us. When we look at the gospel today, it might seem that Jesus is being unreasonably harsh. What's all this talk about hating your family? How does this square with the God of love that Jesus always talks about? Well, in fact, Jesus is using a fairly common teaching method in his time, and that is that when you want to get across something that's really, really important, you kind of take it to extremes. So today, for instance, Jesus says, love God and hate your family. Another example in the gospel would be, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Now, the Lord is not actually literally suggesting that we literally cut our hands off if we sin through them. If that was the case, none of us would have any limbs left, or eyes, or anything. Rather, what he's trying to get across to us is that the consequence of sin is so terrible that we need to avoid it. We need to go to all lengths to avoid sin. We need to seek always to live according to his law, to his teaching, and to avoid sin as much as possible. And so similarly, in today's gospel, we see that the wisdom of God is offered to you and to me through being a disciple of Christ. And to truly be a disciple of Christ means to have total and utter dedication to the Lord. So what Jesus is saying to us is not that you're meant to hate your family or anyone else. But what he is teaching us is that if we want to be true disciples, that means putting your relationship with God before anything or before anyone else. That to be a Christian ultimately means that our communion with God is more important than any other person or career or anything else in our life. In fact, it's even more important than our life. This is what Jesus is trying to get at. Because it's the treasure. The treasure of being a disciple is more valuable than even our lives. And so nothing can come before it. I guess most of us, being ordinary human beings, being bound by original sin and the fallenness that comes from that, most of us would find it difficult, very difficult, to leave all our possessions or leave our family behind in order to follow Christ. But in fact, most of us have not been asked to do this. But other Christians have had a different experience where they've remained faithful disciples of the Lord only through great personal cost. Those who've been persecuted for the faith. Those who have rather died than be unfaithful to Christ. Those who've given up prosperous livelihoods to go and serve the poor. Those who have lost their jobs because they stand up for the truth of Christ. those who make room in their homes for the needy. There are many ways in which being a disciple can actually cost us. We can think of examples of people like Cardinal John Henry Newman, who was one of the great lights of the Anglican Church in the early 19th century, and was one of the great teachers and preachers at Oxford University. When he became a Catholic, he lost a lot of his friends, he lost his job in Oxford, he lost almost everything. But for him, to follow Christ was worth it. It wasn't even a question. But it came at great personal cost. Or to think of somebody like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German Lutheran pastor who was one of the few Christians in Nazi Germany who openly stood up to Hitler. And of course, ultimately he lost his life because of that. A lot of us really have felt the cost of discipleship, if you like, very little. We may be faithful churchgoers, but how do our attitudes to worldly things, to worldly goods, differ to those who don't have the Christian faith? And so the gospel today, like it often does, Jesus is asking us to stop, to pause, to think about how our life of discipleship is going. What's our relationship like with Christ? Our faith, our religion, is not a comfortable religion, domesticated down to just Sunday Mass attendance, or unfortunately these days, even less than that. To take our faith seriously is to walk a rocky road. It is the narrow path, not the wide path. And the gospel advises us that before we set out on this road, we need to make sure that we're determined to finish it. And if that disturbs you, or if you find yourself feeling resistant or it worries you, then all I would say is take heart. Don't be afraid. The Lord and his strength are with us, with you, with me. And we don't have to make the journey into sainthood in one leap. Discipleship is a journey where we take it a step at a time, one foot after the other, following in his footsteps. And when Jesus talks about our family ties and possessions, he's fundamentally talking about changing our attitudes. And all of us can begin to think differently. We can be less consumerist. We can try to be more simple in our tastes. We can begin to find more room in our lives for others, find more time to help those who are less fortunate than ourselves. Prayer can become more real in our lives, and the greatest, of course, is to renew the new covenant at the Sunday Mass every week, which is what Jesus commands and calls us to. Perhaps we can watch less television, have more conversations with the family. I was watching an interesting little meme today where it talked about the fact that our mobile phones have replaced ordinary phones, they've replaced iPods, they've replaced writing letters, they've replaced all sorts of things in our lives. Let's not let them replace our family life. So finding time to perhaps live more simply, finding time for each other. Like Paul in the second reading, we can see other people, other races, colours, nationalities, as truly our brothers and sisters under the one Father in heaven, just as Dietrich Bonhoeffer had the courage to be able to see that was the case with the Jews in Nazi Germany. They were his brothers and sisters under the one Father in heaven. I pray during this week that all of us will respond to the grace of God and truly become wise in the Christian sense of the word, people who have a deep, intimate relationship with God and live that out, because in that is true life. May God bless you.